Hello, everybody. Welcome to Michael's Analysis Show. Going to be doing one here on the canonization of saints and potential problems with saying that they might be fallible. Hope everybody's having a good Friday evening so far. I've seen somebody already in the chat is saying that I'm kicking a hornet's nest. Isn't that what I'm known for doing? I mean, I sort of do that, especially when it comes to these segments. I mean, obviously, we do plenty of other things here as well, interviews, debates, roundtables. But when it comes to these commentary shows, I like to touch on topics that are in dispute among some. So the last few that I've been doing have been on Eastern Orthodoxy, but here I'm going to deal with some internal matters for us folks here in the Catholic Church who are traditional Catholics. So, of course, the position that some maintain is that canonizations could be fallible. In other words, a papal canonization, for instance, is not necessarily infallible, according to some who maintain this view. So it would be possible, for example, for the canonization of, say, Pope Pius, I'm sorry, let's do Pope Paul VI, since that's one that seems to really get people nervous when it comes to this topic. Pope Paul VI, maybe John Paul II, sometimes John the 23rd, especially Paul VI, because of course, his reform of the liturgy and the way he implemented the Second Vatican Council, and John Paul II for sort of the same reason, for his implementation of the Second Vatican Council, and of course for things like Assisi, right? The whole Assisi scandal in 1986. So for issues like that, some people get very concerned when it comes to these canonizations and might maintain that they are fallible. And before I talk about some of the implications, I wanted to briefly just address the different kinds of canonizations, at least ones that I've observed are noteworthy. Of course, you have more of the way that the first millennium conducted canonizations. It was less solemn, it was less formal than you have with papal canonizations. Effectively, Christians would simply recognize this or that person in their community as a saint, and they would become venerated in their territory. So you would have more of a popular canonization, if you will. And then sometimes that reached a universal level. Of course, then you have solemn papal canonizations, and I would divide these into two distinctions. But of course, this is when a pope solemnly declares that somebody is a saint. And when it comes to these, you have the process that has a devil's advocate that looks at the person's life and scrutinizes it and looks for reasons to say that they're not to be emulated, that they did not live a life of heroic virtue. Perhaps it's not to say that they're not in heaven, but they wouldn't be the best example, for instance, for other Christians to emulate. That would be the devil's advocate process. And for quite a while, popes use that process, although not always. And of course, recently that process has been extremely reformed and is almost no longer extant when it comes to these papal solemn canonizations. So one might say that it's almost entirely gone as far as the devil's advocate process, or at least the purpose behind it. So now you have elections, well, not elections, but canonizations of individuals who maybe they didn't have as many miracles attested to their life. Maybe the miracles themselves were somewhat dubious. And then, of course, they didn't necessarily have somebody who examined their life and scrutinized it. So that now canonizations is more just a declaration that they're in heaven rather than they lived a life of heroic virtue. But I will note that it wasn't always the case that these solemn papal canonizations was a declaration of heroic virtue and a life to be emulated. That has been the case in a lot of history when it comes to papal canonizations, but has not always been the case. In other words, there have been papal canonizations where it was just simply understood that they were in heaven. It wasn't necessarily saying that their lives were to be emulated in every aspect. It wasn't excluding that either, but it was just not necessarily affirming that either. Of course, that became a little bit more explicit later on, and once again, that process has been reformed, which I don't think was a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea to reform the process. I think at this point, would have been best to just leave it as it is. So I definitely don't see the prudence of reforming the process and taking away the devil's advocate. I don't think it's a good idea, although I don't think that somehow invalidates the papal canonization or its solemnity or infallibility. It doesn't take away from that, but it definitely does take away an aspect that should not have been taken away. In other words, when it comes to these more recent solemn papal canonizations, I would say that we could still affirm that the individual is in heaven, and I do believe that part is infallible. But why take away this process of a devil's advocate? Why take away this process of scrutinizing the person's life to determine whether or not they should be emulated, and whether or not they lived a life of heroic virtue? There's no reason to take that away. I think that was something good that we added when it comes to canonizations. I think that was something helpful, and I can't really think of any good reasons to have removed that. If there are good reasons, I'm just not familiar with them. So I'm not really sure if it was the most prudent decision to do that. But again, I don't think it takes away from their infallibility. The infallibility part just simply means that that person is in heaven. That's all. But of course, we can, I think, genuinely criticize not whether or not the canonization is infallible, but I think that we can criticize whether or not we should have removed the devil's advocate in that process and reducing canonizations to just merely a declaration that this person is in heaven. Um, even though that sometimes was the case historically as far as what it was. Now, the other one that I've recognized is called, well, I call it at least implicit canonizations. And this is where you have Eastern Catholics, formerly Eastern Orthodox, who come into communion with the Catholic Church and they bring their liturgical calendar with them. And Rome might critique some aspects to it, but then tacitly or implicitly approves of its liturgical calendar, which would then be an implicit approval of the saints that are on there. And some of these saints were individuals who died outside of communion with the Catholic Church. So they are venerated by by Orthodox, but they were never solemnly venerated, or I should say canonized, in the Catholic Church. But there's this implicit recognition that they're a saint by Rome accepting their liturgical calendar, knowing that this individual is on there. So those are the different kinds of canonizations that I've seen historically. There might be more, but those are just the ones I'm familiar with. And I would say in all of these cases, I think that we can affirm an infallibility that the individual is in heaven, but I do not think all of those ways of canonizing a saint are equal when it comes to establishing whether or not that person lived a life of heroic virtue. I do think the papal way, not the popular way, but more the papal way with its devil advocate process would be the best when it comes to establishing heroic virtue among the others. Of course, solemn canonizations without that process, implicit canonizations, or popular canonizations. I think they all have their purpose, but I do think that the solemn papal canonizations with the devil's advocate process would be the best in establishing a life of heroic virtue. So now let's, having said all that, let's maybe talk about a couple of the implications of denying the infallibility to these canonizations, especially when it comes to solemn papal canonizations. I would argue the same when it comes to popular canonizations on a universal level. Maybe not on a local level, but on a universal level, I would argue this, and also on the level of implicit canonizations, I would make these arguments. But we're going to especially focus here on solemn papal canonizations. And just so y'all know, we got another show coming up here in just a little bit. It's in 25 minutes with Dr. Matthew Minard. He's going to continue his lectures on the Summa Theologica. He's going to be going over the virtue of prudence. So we'll be discussing that shortly. That's why I'm somewhat rushing this one because I wanted to sneak it in before Dr. Minard's lecture in light of just some timely issues that are going on right now on social media when it comes to this topic. So I thought I would throw out my 2 cents for whatever it's worth. But yeah, talking about the implications, possible implications here for saying that these solemn papal canonizations could be fallible. Well, one of them is I would say it's an implicit undermining of the sanctity of the church. Nobody who is actually saying that these are fallible is intending, to my knowledge, to say that the church is no longer the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church and that it's no longer holy in its liturgy. To my knowledge, nobody is saying that. But I do think that it is implied, whether one realizes it or not, because just think about it. If you have a pope who solemnly, mind you, because the Pope is still using in these recent canonizations with Paul VI the same definitive indicators that were present in the preconciliar and pre-reformed use of solemn papal canonizations, still using the exact same language. So if you were to look at, for example, the canonization of Pope Paul VI, the same language that was used previously with the devil's advocate process, even prior to the Second Vatican Council, and then also prior to some of these reforms, they're using the same language. So you would basically have to say that this would not be a definitive decision, that it would be fallible, not only in its present form, but then you would also have to apply, if you're going to be consistent, to the previous way of solemnly canonizing saints, because effectively the same indicators are present. So you would have to basically critique the whole system of papal canonizations, which some people don't have a problem doing. They'll say the whole thing, yeah, it's all subject to fallibility. And they would say in the case of Paul VI that that's probably a fallible case. Well, the implication I would say is you have here a pope who is, number one, using definitive indicators, some of the very indicators that he uses in something that's declared ex cathedra. He's using these definitive indicators. And if those aren't indicators of a definitive decision today, there then is no objective way. There are no objective indicators to determine what has been taught definitively by Pope, for example. There would be nothing objective, which I think is absurd. And the Eastern Orthodox try to use that argument against us and say that we don't have objective indicators. So you really don't know when anything has been taught infallibly by Pope. And I always respond and say that's not true. There are consistent objective indicators that are used today when it comes to, for example, a teaching that's ex cathedra. And again, those very indicators are present in these canonizations. So what you would have to do is one of two things. You would have to say um, that these, well, let me back it up before I actually get to that. I wanted to say one other thing before I talk about secondary objects of infallibility and some of the implications there. You would have to say that it is possible for a pope to solemnly recognize the veneration of an individual who's now going to be eligible for us to have parishes named after them. Their bones are going to be in our altars. They're going to be venerated at our altars. You're now going to have explicit approval for this for somebody who is potentially in hell. You would have to say that, yeah, that's the case. The Pope, the church itself, universal, could theoretically give its explicit and solemn approbation to the veneration of a person who's going to be venerated on our altars or at our altars, um, and many other liturgical uses. Maybe even could enter into the liturgical calendar. And yet this person is in hell. I would say that is an undermining of the church's sanctity in its liturgy at that point. I think you've gone too far. If you can afford that, in the church's liturgical practice, I'm not sure what you would exclude. I mean, what would be something that would falsify our claim to sanctity when it comes to our way of worship? What would serve to falsify our claim? I think that would be a really good example. More importantly, there's quite a few saints and theologians who would back me up on that one, that would see this as being problematic. Um, Now, on to the other issue, because there have been some historically that have questioned uh, the certitude of these papal canonizations, whether or not they're infallible. Is this certainly established? Back when secondary objects of infallibility was in dispute, I could see that argument. I could see some people questioning that, even though I think they still run up against my objection there when it comes to the church's sanctity. But I could still see some breathing room, some space there for people to have this discussion when secondary objects of infallibility was a debate. And just for those who aren't familiar, secondary objects of infallibility pertains to those things that are necessary to preserve logically and or historically something that is dogmatic, something that is in a primary object, something that is in scripture tradition explicitly or implicitly, something that is in the deposit of faith that has been handed down to us, that is part of revelation, that is God breathed. Right. So it's logically or historically necessary for us to preserve it in order to preserve something it's connected to. So, for example, one of the often um, used examples when it comes to secondary objects of infallibility is the ability to solemnly declare that the Council of Nicaea, for example, was a legitimate ecumenical council. If somebody were to come around and say, "Well, Nicaea one did say that Jesus is homoousios with the Father, but I don't believe Nicaea was truly an ecumenical council." If somebody were to come around and say that, it is possible for the Pope to, or even an ecumenical council, to solemnly declare that Nicaea one was an ecumenical council and bind you to hold that definitively, to be held definitively is the language used. Um, so it's not an object of faith because it's not part of revelation. God never revealed Nicaea was a true ecumenical council, but it's necessary to guard something that God did reveal, which is that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father, because that has been revealed. Not that very term, but that concept has been revealed in sacred scripture and tradition. So that's the classic example. Another example, however, is papal canonizations. If you were to say, for example, that, okay, well, Pope Pius XII gave us a teaching that was ex cathedra, but you know what? I don't believe Pope Pius XII was actually a pope. Um, Not only could they canonize Pope Pius XII, but you could also just have a pope or a council solemnly declare that he was a pope without actually canonizing him, but at least declare that he was a pope, right? Because this is a historical matter that is logically connected to something that is part of the deposit of faith, namely his teaching that was ex cathedra. Okay, so um, you would have these different examples that are given for secondary objects of infallibility. And, for a while, some disputed whether or not secondary objects could be objects of infallibility. So I could see somebody saying, well, then a papal canonization is open for dispute when it comes to these. Although I don't know any of them who would actually have objected to any of the canonizations. They were just more talking about these things theoretically. Um, but now that we've had some implicit things in Vatican I, but especially you've had with Lumen Gentium, you've had some papal documents in 73 and even later under John Paul II. You even have our profession of faith to John Paul II provided, the profession of faith that he offered. The second paragraph discusses secondary objects of infallibility and notes that they are definitive, which definitive, according to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, it necessarily includes the idea that it's infallible, because it's impossible for the church to universally definitively bind somebody, the whole church, to something that's erroneous. So when we speak of something being definitive, as the second paragraph teachings in the profession of faith speak about, it would necessarily include infallibility. So you've had many instances of the church confirming that secondary objects are infallible, and then you also have even the profession of faith, which a profession of faith is more than just merely authentic magisterial teaching. A profession of faith is a pretty big deal. I mean, it's kind of like saying, well, the Nicene Creed, well, it wasn't taught ex cathedra. There's no canon, actually about well, I mean, there are some canons that are about the creed, but there's no canon saying this is the creed that you're to recite. Uh, Although, of course, it is professed at an ecumenical council. Um, but the point is, a profession of faith, as we generally recognize in the Catholic Church, carries matters that, or speaks of matters that are definitive. To argue that there's something in the profession of faith that is not definitive, you're on really, really shaky ground at that point. And you really wouldn't have a whole lot of basis for that. So again, it's mentioned in our profession of faith and in quite a few other magisterial documents in the post-conciliar era, which is why secondary objects of infallibility is pretty much not disputed today. I don't know anybody who's disputing whether or not secondary objects are eligible to be matters taught infallibly. I don't know anybody who disputes that anymore, because that's pretty well established. The last thing that I wanted to say before we get going here, because we have that lecture with Dr. Monard, now the question really is, are solemn papal canonizations, are they secondary objects of infallibility? Are they? That's ultimately where the debate is. Not, is there such a thing as a secondary object, and could it be infallible? But now the question would be, are papal canonizations secondary objects? I would argue, based not only on the witness of quite a few others, but I would argue necessarily yes, because it's intimately bound with our understanding of the church and its sanctity when it comes to matters of worship. So I would argue, yes, it is a secondary object of infallibility. Now, um, you could still make another round away the argument, and effectively say that, well, if somebody were to, for example, deny Pius the 12th and his teaching that was ex cathedra, and say that, well, Pope Pius the 12th was ineligible to teach something ex cathedra, because he wasn't actually the Pope at that time. I could see that being resolved by just saying, well, this by Pope definitively saying that the Pope was actually the Pope at the time, that Pope Pius the 12th was actually a Pope. I could see him doing that. I could also see him including the idea that he was also a saint, but that's not necessary to make the claim that he was Pope at the time. So I understand that's not a necessary argument that would say these are secondary objects of infallibility. But I do think it is implied in the idea that our liturgy is something holy, and there can't be any kind of substantial ruptures in it, and there can't be anything that is just horrendous in our liturgy when it comes to official promulgation of the liturgy, that is just so defective that you could actually venerate somebody who's in hell. Now, I'm not speaking here about the culpability of any individual who venerates somebody who might not have been a historical figure or something. I'm talking about the church giving its solemn approbation behind somebody who's in hell, an approbation to venerate that individual, for them to be under our altars, for them to be even added to our liturgy itself. I mean, anybody who is a canonized saint is really eligible, at least potentially, for that. And it would be kind of awkward for us to be liturgically venerating somebody who's in hell. Um, I think that would really undermine our witness to being the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And holiness there includes our liturgical practices. So I would say because of that, I would say this falls under secondary objects of infallibility, because I think it would otherwise undermine our very claim to the creed, to being the Church of the Creed. So those are my just brief preliminary thoughts on the matter. I'm sure I'll be offering some more in-depth thoughts. This was just kind of first blush thoughts on the matter of some of the issues being discussed recently when it comes to this topic. So hopefully that was helpful to y'all and maybe sparks some good conversations. If y'all have any other arguments that you think might lend itself to papal canonizations being objects of secondary objects of infallibility, I'm definitely interested. I do know that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in the commentary of Archbishop Bertone, he was Archbishop then, Archbishop Bertone and Cardinal Ratzinger, I know they do mention papal canonizations, to my recollection, as secondary objects. So it's not just something I'm making up out of nowhere. They also see these as secondary objects of infallibility. So that should be in the commentary on the Professio Fidei, the very profession of faith that I was previously mentioning there by John Paul II, that speaks of these secondary objects of infallibility. They're giving in this document different examples. And one of them that they give was solemn papal canonizations as a secondary object of infallibility. Now, of course, the document itself is not magisterial. It says that it was released under the offices of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. There was no kind of formal papal approbation, but there was definitely no papal rejection of the document. I mean, it was definitely done under the auspices of the Pope, but he didn't give any kind of formal magisterial approval to it. So very technically speaking, this commentary that we're referring to is not magisterial, but I do think that it is probably one of the best documents, although there are some things to criticize in it, one of the best documents out there when it comes to understanding the magisterium. So I've found it to be incredibly helpful. And here it's backing me up on this. So I hope, like I said, I hope this has been helpful. And if y'all have any questions, just let me know, put them in the chat. Whenever this posts on YouTube, I'll do my best to get to them. But of course, for the time being, don't forget to subscribe, share this on your social media, like the video. And of course, check us out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support us. And you also get extra access to content that we're releasing. And check us out here in about, 5 minutes. Yeah, 5 minutes. We have our show with Dr. Matthew Mondard, where he's going to be doing his lectures from the Summa Theologica on the virtue of prudence. So y'all stay tuned for that in just a few moments. See you on a little bit. God bless.